Lydia lived in Russia and Germany and England, and she wrote mostly poetry in all three languages. And I recently found myself collecting and editing her writings, which ended up as this quite chunky volume. And I want to talk about Lydia largely from the point of view of what she wrote, not limiting myself to her life in England, because as a teenager in Russia, Lydia was already composing. Kathy, are you doing, yes, number five. Next one. This is Lydia as a teenager in Russia. She was already writing at that stage, and one of her early poems, called Вспышки магния, Magnesium Flares, is about being a poet. And she writes, I roughly translate, if you find that your soul, like magnesium ribbon, flares up and burns with a dazzling brilliance, perhaps then your poetry is no illusion, perhaps it is true, and you were born a poet. Если душа ваша, лентой магнезия, вспыхнув, горит ослепительным светом, может, не выдумка ваша поэзия, может, вы правда родились поэтом. During those teenage years, serene lyrical poetry, perhaps inspired by sleeping animals on a hot summer's day, or the lonely, impassive moon above the mysterious streets of Moscow at midnight, all that is joined by heartfelt love poems. And I just want to quote a few lines from one of those poems, where she writes about a posy of blue cornflowers her friend gave to her, whose petals prick and tickle your nose. Oh, that pungent smell that moves me to tears and tightly clamps my throat. Its sharpness calls up memories in a way not even music can match. Запах синих васильков, они кололись лепестками чуть-чуть и щекотали нос. О, терпкий запах, он до слез меня доводит и тисками сжимает горло. Острота его родит воспоминания, и даже музыка, и та сравниться с ним не в состоянии. But pain and heartbreak were around the corner. That love affair ended unhappily when Lydia accompanied her parents to Germany. It was 1921, she was only 19. She loved and missed Russia, and many of her Russian poems are filled with sadness and longing. But they're very creative and very varied, now in the style of an epic poem, now a folk ballad, or again something in the style of Pushkin. Lydia went on to study in Munich and found work and friends there. Next one, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, yes, that's right. This is actually an identity photograph of her for some German ID document. Lydia worked as a biochemist at a research institute and began writing poetry in German. She captured many of her colleagues in a long series of witty, satirical verses, which earned her admiration and a sort of wary respect because of her mercilessly accurate observation. And here are some of her friends and victims. This is Lydia in the front, and probably each one of those had some satirical verses written about them. But I want to quote a different sort of light-hearted poem that she wrote in German, which she wrote for her baby niece Helen, Josephine's daughter, when Helen was just learning to talk mostly German, of course, but she had to learn Russian too. So Lydia wrote her these bilingual macaronic lines in a mixture of German and Russian to help her with animal names, all about the ponderous elephant, the monkey stealing the cream, and the cat teasing the dog. I know there are some German speakers here, so I'll give you some of this. Schau mal, alle diese Zveri sind vom Tierpark dir bekannt. Mühsam kriecht durch enge Dveri dieser Swan, der Elefant. Und es steckt die Abisiane, wenn der Wärter sie nicht sieht, Noss und Rot in weiße Sahne und verschmiert sich ganz damit. Und Sabake bellt, sie leidet, weil die Koschka auf dem Baum sitzt und schlau glediert. Sie snает, hier erwischt der Hund sie kaum. During the later years in Germany, at the same time that Nazi persecution was intensifying, Lydia met and fell in love with our father Leonid Slater, who was an English psychiatrist studying in Munich. In 1935, they left for England, where they married, and as I told you, by 1938, Eliot had succeeded in extricating the rest of the Pasternak family too. And eventually they all settled in Oxford. This is my English grandfather, my English grandmother, Lydia, my mother, and then Leonid and Rosalia, the Russian grandparents. So they all lived in the same house, which Eliot had arranged. After that came the war, and Lydia at the same time suffered a string of personal misfortunes. Her mother died in 1939, her father in 1945, and Eliot, after spending the war away from us in London, left for good. So Lydia had to bring up her children largely on her own, while running the large Oxford house as a university lodging house to make ends meet. And I remember my mother at that time in the 1940s, and she wasn't a happy person. She was surrounded by people, dependents, refugees, hangers-on, lots of those, undergraduates and other lodgers, needy people. But she had few real friends, and she was very lonely. Her closest companion was her sister Josephine, but Josephine was very often ill with her neuroses. And although Lydia had very little leisure to be creative, she continued to write. Some of her poems of those years are in Russian, others are in English, but they all have similar themes: unhappy love, lost love, solitude, and the way those things are echoed in nature which she also loved passionately. One of the poems of that time is called Cornflowers, and it adds a sad coda to the Cornflower poem I quoted earlier. Please, do not bring me flowers anymore, at least not those so full of recollections. They speak of things you never meant to say, reviving dreams of long-forgotten beauty. Those deep blue prickly petals, how they smell of things long past, when life was still a promise, of yellow fields, a Russian countryside, of summer heat and happiness and sunshine, the sky so blue above the golden rye, the lark's unceasing joy amid the sky, and warm, discreet blue flowers, dry and sweet, collected by small hands among the wheat. Some of the poems are much, much blacker, reflecting a mood of bitter despair. On an age-old raft, cold, heavy and grim, lies a load of leaden sorrow. Black waters mutter. It has to swim to the never reach of tomorrow. And it ends. It is here in my veins, this load of lead, and the leaden sorrow will never sink. That is actually the twin of a poem that she had written in Russian on the same theme many years earlier, and her life in England had evidently brought it back to her. But it wasn't all black. She was devoted to her family. This was something she didn't write poems about, and here she is with her eldest child, my brother Michael. And she brought together her love of her children, her love of Russia, and her love of nature in various ways in her writing. On one holiday, she took us children to the Scottish Highlands. We hiked round the mountains, staying in youth hostels and obsessively picking mushrooms like a proper Russian family. She recognized, or she hoped she recognized, the ones she used to pick as a child. And she would cry out to us across the slopes in Russian, "Look, here's a lisichka, a chanterelle. It has to be, or a syrayevka, a rasula, or a bielый grib, a sep. Surely there must be." I learned a lot of Russian mushroom names on those expeditions, but she was never entirely sure of her diagnosis. In the evenings, we'd cook up all we had gathered in a casserole in the youth hostel kitchen, and the other visitors would look on in amazement and wait for us to die of the night. And she walked and climbed almost passionately, day after day, and breathed in the spectacular views. She had always been very fond of that. This is not in Scotland, it's in Bavaria, but she did a lot of hiking of that sort all through her life. Well, there's no poem about the mushroom expedition, but there is plenty of other nature poetry, both in English and in Russian. The summer night is wonderfully silent, no leaf is trembling, not a sound is heard. A universe of stars has seized the island, and non-existent yet are beast and bird. And what did she do when she wasn't on holiday? For a long time her life revolved around her growing family. We only talked Russian at home. It seemed that in a way she was trying to create an outpost of the Russian Pasternaks in England. And although Lydia had many personal friends of all origins and nationalities, she didn't integrate herself into Oxford life, not town and not gown. Well, gradually her family grew up. We two sons went off to boarding school, and she began to have time to do what she wanted. And at about the same time, with Stalin dead, Russia was becoming a bit less remote, and Lydia began experimenting with translating Boris's poems. In 1956, when it became possible for the first time to exchange letters with the Moscow family again, Lydia very quickly sent Boris some of her translations for his opinion, and she was overjoyed that he liked them. From then on, she worked hard at this. It was probably her favorite occupation. The correspondence between the two sisters in Oxford and their brother Boris in Moscow is a very moving one, and it's been collected, and I translated it into English in this book there. On one occasion, Boris responded very enthusiastically to a photograph Lydia had sent him. This is the photograph. It's Lydia with her 4 children. So that's Michael, whom you've heard. This is me. Catherine is not here this evening. but the baby is Anne, whom you will hear next. Boris wrote that he loved the delighted, smiling faces, but he also said that he was pleased not to see any of the despotic effects of family likeness in them. In his view, we didn't look like our mother. Well, Lydia had other goals as well. One of them was to win proper recognition for her parents as artists, and particularly for her father Leonid, whose painting was practically unknown in England. And it was she with her sister Josephine who tried to mobilize all their contacts among the Oxford intelligentsia and the art world in general to help them. And at first they met with total indifference, if not resistance and hostility. And they came to detest and despise the British artistic establishment for its haughty narrow-mindedness. But Boris Pasternak's growing reputation changed all that, and suddenly Pasternak became a name to be conjured with, and the sisters seized their chance, and it was through their efforts that the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford held a memorial exhibition of Pasternak in 1958, and that was followed by exhibitions in other British cities and abroad. All of those efforts required Lydia to become something of a public personage, which was really quite alien to her. She knew a lot of Oxford characters, but as I've said, she didn't normally have much time for them. It was Josephine who had much more social poise, and she was friendly with Oxford figures like Isaiah Berlin, Maurice Bowra, the various Oxford professors of Russian. Lydia tended to treat them all with reserve, and we didn't see much of them at home. In fact, she had quite a set-to with Maurice Bowra, whom she suspected of plagiarizing one of her happy inventions, a particular quatrain in her translation of Boris Pasternak's Spring 1944. The quatrain is, "It all will have the haze of fairy tales upon it, like the gilt and dazzle of ornaments in boyar chambers and on the cathedral of St. Basil." Bowra still that one. But when Boris Pasternak became a personage of worldwide interest, Lydia suddenly found herself coping with journalists, film crews, and broadcasters from all over the world. And now she was much more in the firing line than Josephine with her rather more retiring nature. Lydia didn't care. She received anyone and everyone who turned up, and no one could overawe her. Josephine once said of her, "She's the real aristocrat among us. She treats everyone the same, whether it's a professor, an ambassador, a refugee, or the dustman." And how she received them was very characteristic of her, probably wearing her old overcoat, sitting in her kitchen with the Victorian coal-fired stove that she loved, and she would treat them all to instant coffee and ginger biscuits. Getting her translations accepted by the literary world was every bit as difficult as getting her father's paintings accepted by the world of art. Boris was famous enough, and he appreciated her style of translation. He wrote to one correspondent, "I think Lydia Slater attains much more with her fidelity to rhythm and rhyme. To communicate its inner force and impetus and music is to reach all, I believe." But her translations, which were aimed at reproducing the musical character of the originals, were deeply unfashionable in the 1960s, and commercial publishers weren't interested. She got some 15 poems published by a very small-time publisher called Peter Russell, and she pressed on. She would read to literary societies and student groups, and somehow she came to the notice of the alternative poetry and jazz personalities of the time, people like Danny Absey and Adrian Mitchell, who liked her and included her in a number of their public poetry readings. And the highlight of all that was an event at the Royal Festival Hall where she shared the programme with beat poets, including Allen Ginsberg. One wonders what the audience made of this intense elderly Russian woman standing up with bearded young beatniks in jeans, but she was enthusiastically applauded. The last of her important interests was her music. The daughter of a brilliant musician, she was taught the piano by her mother, and in Oxford she possessed an upright Bechstein which she loved. She taught all of us children to play, but when we were small we rarely heard her play herself. It was not till the 1950s that this changed through a lucky chance. She discovered that there lived in Oxford an Austrian-Czech refugee called Leonid Gombrich, the mother of the art historian Ernst Gombrich. And this was my mother drew her teacher. She actually was a neat hand with a pencil as well. That's a very good likeness. So Leonid Gombrich had been a pupil of Theodore Leschetizky, who had also taught Lydia's mother Rosalia, and whom Rosalia had worshipped. Leonid agreed to give Lydia lessons, and from that time we began to hear her practicing at home and playing most beautifully, playing essentially for herself, although Leonid Gombrich had told her, when you play you must always play for someone, even if it's only the charwoman. She did record one or two of her pieces on a very primitive tape recorder. But I'm certain that for her, the greatest sense of fulfillment and personal achievement came when her poetry was read and appreciated in public. And if I've got time, I'd like to just play her reading one poem at one of these public meetings.
Мело, мело по всей земле, во все пределы. Свеча горела на столе, свеча горела. It swept on all the earth at every turning. A candle on the table flared, a candle burning. Like swarms of midges to a flame in summer weather, snowflakes flew up towards the pane in flocks together. Snow-molded arrows, rings and stars, the pane adorning. A candle on the table shone, a candle burning. Entangled shadows spread across the flickering ceiling. Entangled arms, entangled legs, and doom and feeling. And with a thud against the floor, two shoes came falling, and drops of molten candle wax like tears were rolling. And all was lost in snowy mist, grey-white and blurring. A candle on the table stood, a candle burning. The flame was trembling in the draught. Heat of temptation it lifted up to crossing wings as of an angel. All February the snowstorm swept, each time returning, a candle on the table wept, a candle burning.